Hi, sixth grade. Welcome back. This video is going to be looking at the compare and contrast essay in your giant textbook, and we are on page 331. So before we get to the essay, which is on the next page, 332, it's a good idea to read the background information because this is a historical essay, or not a historical essay, but an essay looking at a historical event. So you need to read the background so you understand what's going on. Remember, compare and contrast is two different things. So if you're writing compare and contrast, you need to show similarities, which is comparing, and contrast, which is differences. So when you do that Venn diagram, which is circles that meet in the middle, usually you have differences of each, and then the middle part is the similarities. So you've done this before, maybe you're just not in the type of essay that this is presenting. So we're going to start with the reading focus on page 331, which talks about understanding, compare, and contrast, and then we're going to go down to that blue box, the background, which will give us some insight to our essay. Compare and contrast. People make sense of the world by noting ways in which people, places, and ideas are similar, which is comparing, and different, which is contrasting. The next time you're with friends, notice how often they use a comparison or a contrast. The article that follows is about segregation in the United States before 1954. Until then, segregation was legal as long as separate but equal facilities were provided for whites and African Americans. In some parts of the countries, it was not unusual to encounter signs such as the whites only, colored not allowed, signs that confused and upset Lois in The Gold Cadillac, which is a story that we did not read, but it's previous to this, so if you want to check that out, please do. To help us understand what segregation was like, the writer of this article compares life for blacks and for whites under segregation. Every American should know about the two cases mentioned in this article, Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. As you read about the cases, note the differences between schools and other facilities for whites and for blacks. And now we're on the blue part, the background at the bottom half of the page, informational text and social studies. Legal cases are given names that usually indicate who is arguing against whom. Plessy versus Ferguson is a case that involves someone named Plessy arguing against someone named Ferguson. The V stands for versus, for the Latin for against. Plessy was an African American man who in 1982 was forced to leave a train car that was reserved for whites. In a Louisiana court, he challenged the state law requiring separate train cars for blacks and whites. Judge John H. Ferguson decided against Plessy. The case eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court, where Plessy argued that the law violated the U.S. Constitution. Plessy lost his case. The majority held that requiring a separate but equal facility was lawful. Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas is the name of the suit brought in 1951 by Oliver Brown on behalf of his daughter Linda. The Browns lived in Topeka, Kansas, where Linda attended a blacks-only elementary school. Brown sued the Topeka Board of Education and lost the case. Some months later, Brown and the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which combined their case with several other school segregation cases. In 1954, the court ruled in favor of Brown. Brown versus Board of Education was one of the most important cases brought before the Supreme Court in the 20th century. So that should sound familiar to you, just some background information, which is great to understand before we read the essay on the following page, which is separate but never equal. It should look like that. And again, the structure here is compare and contrast. So remember that as we read. We're on page 332, and we're going to start with that information in red, which is a quote. When I was a boy, I would go downtown, and I'd see the sign saying white and colored on the water fountains. There'd be a beautiful shining water fountain in one corner of the store marked white, and another corner was just a little spigot marked colored. I saw the sign saying white men, and white women and colored women. And at the theater, we had to go upstairs to go to a movie. You bought your ticket at the same window that the white people did, but they could sit downstairs and you had to go upstairs. That quote was by U.S. Congressman and Civil Rights leader John Lewis. Now we're on the right side of the page, 332. In 1986, in a famous case known as Plessy versus Ferguson, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that states could enact laws separating people by skin color as long as the facilities for African Americans were equivalent to those for whites. This separate but equal decision stood for more than half a century, supporting a system of racial segregation in states throughout the South. In reality, separate was never equal. Take buses, for example. The fare was the same for all passengers regardless of race, but if the white section at the front of the bus filled up, the invisible line separating it from the colored section simply moved back. Black people had to stand up so that white people could sit. Consider shopping. An African American woman could buy the same dress as a white woman, but she wasn't allowed to try it on in the store, or if she found that it didn't fit, she couldn't return it. Or restaurants. Some white-owned restaurants filled orders for blacks only at their takeout window. Others wouldn't serve them at all. Perhaps most separate and most unequal were public schools. If you attended a colored school, you might walk 8 miles to school every morning, while buses full of white children drove past on their way to schools close by. The schools attended by white children would be modern and well-maintained. Now we're on page 333. While yours would be old and run down. White students would have up-to-date books and materials, while you might be forced to share a 20-year-old textbook with 3 other students. In 1949, several African American parents sued their school district over the inequalities between the local white elementary school and the school their children were forced to attend. 2 years earlier, the district had built a brand new school for white students while leaving the black student school in disrepair. Unlike the all-black schools, the all-white schools had an auditorium, a kindergarten, a part-time music teacher, a well-equipped playground, and a lunch program. The all-white school had a teacher and a separate room for each grade, and the all-black schools had only 2 teachers and 2 classrooms for all 8 grades. Whew, can't imagine that. Finally, in 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Brown versus Board of Education that segregated schools were in their very nature unequal. No longer would the highest court in the land support the myth of Plessy versus Ferguson. Separate could never be equal. So that essay is comparing and contrasting differences in the separate but equal era that allowed different facilities for African Americans and white people, which were said to be equal, but obviously weren't. So Brown versus Board of Education was important because it ended that and said that separate was never equal, because as we saw in that essays, yes, there would be schools for each, but they were never equal. Some were kept and some were not. There was technology in some and technology in not in technology in other. So luckily that has ended and we all get to go to school wherever we want and it is equal. So I'm happy that we live in this time that we do now and don't have to go back to that. But it's important to remember what our country did look like and remember who fought for those rights that we all have, that we all get to enjoy. So remember that structure of compare and contrast as you read that essay. And if you have questions, please reach out. This one should be pretty easy to understand. You've got the background information, you've got the notes on the previous page. But if you're struggling, let me know and I'd love to help. Thanks, guys.